I woke to steam and the steady metallic rhythm of ladles striking steel. The galley was a dim cathedral at that hour. Oval lights guttered down to a dull red, and the only real illumination came from the breath of the cauldrons. Steam curled like prayers up the vents, stinging my eyes, tasting of salt and the resin we used to keep ration tins from seizing. My hands already remembered the dance. 2 scoops for the sergeant, 1 for the helmsman, half a scoop extra for the kid who always missed his sleep shift. By the time my feet hit the grated floor, my arms were already aching from motions I had done 1,000 times. On a ship the size of this one, a hot meal could stop a man from losing himself for a day that made me more than cook. It made me a small god of portion and timing. I set the biggest cauldron first, the one that fed the lower decks. The lid came off with a hiss, and the smell hit me like a remembered insult. Porridge thick with pulverized oats and something sweetened with preserved fruit, soot at the rim where the ignition jets licked too close. I tasted it for salt and for lies. Steam has a way of holding secrets. And then I stirred. The ladle scraped the pot in a rhythm that matched the engines. I kept a ledger that only the kitchen knew, portion by portion, who had eaten tonight, who had begged for more, who had been skipped to keep ration integrity. My identity was counted in scoops. Men traded gratitude like coins. A satisfied grunt at noon meant another day without a mutiny. The crew treated my food like prayer. They did not kneel. They did not speak in hushed voices. But they brought me knives cleaned and polished, empty ration tins for me to seal, and the occasional talisman left by a grateful hand. A stitched patch, a brass cog, a hymn scrawled on vellum, those things found their way into a keepsake drawer in the galley beside the salt. No one thanked me for making the stew exactly right. They thanked me with steadier hands on their rifles, with a willingness to follow orders through another watch. I fed them, and in return they gave me silence and a place in the ship's small, brutal social order. That morning there was a sound I did not expect. I lifted a lid, and the soup answered me, not with steam, but with a thin, sibilant murmur that sat on the broth like a new spice. It was too articulated to be a boil. The voice formed syllables that wanted to be names. I stepped back, ladle held midair, and the noise settled. I listened for the worse, then for the sensible. Rats in the vents, a cracked communication in the hull, the crew at the bulkhead whispering about numbers, but nothing fit. The sound came from under the lid, as if someone had spoken from the belly of the ship and waited to see who would listen. "Did you hear that?" called Jensen, one of the stokers, leaning in on his forearms. He smelled of engine grease and old smoke. His voice was low, he asked, as a man asking about a shadow on his wall. You could see men start to shift in the doorways, shoulders tensing like drawn ropes. We were a crew trained to ignore ghosts. The ship told better lies than most worlds fear had to be economically rationed. But the murmur had threaded itself through the routine, and now it had leverage. I lifted the lid again, as if the motion would explain the sound. Steam wrapped my fingers, and the smell of the pot opened into something different. Tannin, damp wood, old cloth. There was the faintest suggestion of an accent beneath the steam, like a trader who had stitched two dialects together. It answered no one and answered me. The words did not matter. What mattered was that someone or something was speaking inside my cooking, and that speech implied an origin, an arrival. The galley, which had always been about measured things, salt, ration, heat, became uncertain on a single breath. A capped crate came down the service hatch with more force than use demanded. It rolled across the grated floor on iron-bound wheels and brought new smells with it. Scorched lacquer, the sour suggestion of antiseptic, and something that tasted of old metal. Deckhands manhandled it like it was heavier than it should be. The crate had been in the skirmish forward. It carried the blunt, tired air of battlefields. Someone had chased it aboard with gloves on, and no questions. Stamped on the lid in a faded seal was a sigil I knew only by sight, a commerce house mark, the sort that said, "Pay the price and don't look inside." And there were cracks in the wood that had been patched with burn marks and salt. They put the crate by the oil drum while I watched. The men who wheeled it in kept their faces blank, which is what people do when they want an event to stop being interesting. I recognized the maneuver. Bring the problem to the cook, because cooks cannot help but open boxes. It is the old superstition of the galley. If food will fill the hole, let the cook see the hole first. That superstition was older than our captain. I felt its tug in my ribs, a small electric pinch that made my fingers itch to pry a seal. The sergeant, wide, hard-jawed Colt, glared at the crate like it was a poor apology. "Quarantine it," he said, and the word carried. Quarantine on a moving metal coffin is a bureaucratic thing. It is a circle drawn around possibility. He tapped the stamp with a thick knuckle. From the forward shuttle. Came on with the salvage crew. He did not finish the sentence, because the end of every sentence in the salvage runs reads the same. Bodies, taken. Left behind, seal intact, I asked. My voice sounded small in the galley's echo chamber. That was all the question I had the right to ask. Colt shrugged, and the men shifted their weight like they were passing a coin. Looks sealed. Boarded and cleared, by report. But it smells wrong. Jensen's nostrils flared as he spoke. The word wrong isn't precise, but it is honest. It sits on the tongue and makes the mouth close. The rhythm of the day changed then. The ladle no longer tapped the pot on schedule. The ration list sat like an accusation on the bench. Men waited at the hatch, their jackets buttoned, their minds half in their mess tins and half forward at the crate. I felt the shift like a weight on the back of my neck. Orders in the ship travel in a slow, measured way. A bell for muster, a bark for the watch, a silent pulse through the engineering ring. This was different. It felt like a new chord struck under the hum of the reactor, something that wanted to rearrange the daily harmonics. I thought of recipes, old ones taught to me by a grandmother who had fed miners on a damp world. Recipes can be ethical documents. They ask you to choose. A pinch more of salt, and a man will not ask. Twice use a bitter root, and you remember where the ration came from. In the narrow space between ladle and pot, I kept moral accounting. Would unleashing this crate mean saving someone or ruin? I had no right to decide, and like all cooks who survive, I decided anyway. I turned the sealed crate so I could read the stamp better, fingers catching on splinters. The wood felt warmer than it should. Either the engine heat had soaked it through, or something inside had a pulse. People speak around me when I'm thinking. It's the way they let me move my mouth without interference. Jensen leaned in. "If it's salvage," he said, "it could be ration packs, could be spirits, could be anything." He smiled without humor. His eyes looked like portholes into a deck I did not want to visit. Colt spat on the grating. "Open in the morgue," he said. That was a rule of thumb. If something looks like the smell of battle, let it be examined where the legal tools live. The morgue sits 3 levels down and smells of chemicals and patience. It is the place for explanations you do not want in the galley. He tried to pass the decision. He tried to make the problem mechanical. I held the crate and ran a thumb along the seam. There was a faint strip of wax over the nails, an old habit that secured the contents. Under the wax was a secondary binding made of fiber and something metallic. Whoever sealed it had wrapped it with care. Whoever opened it would have to be careful too. Opening a sealed crate on a ship is not just curiosity. It is a contract with consequences. A wrong thing revealed could spread like steam through the vents. The crew's faces made small requests. Some wanted more food. Some wanted to go back to the hole where their work mattered. The kid who slept through watch and came hungrier than superstition asked me for an extra spoon. He wasn't thinking in anything bigger than his stomach, which was honest and simple. But I thought about the ledger. One extra spoon could be the start of a habit. Habits on a ship become alliances, or rot. I thought of the voice that had nested under the lid. It was not music or wind. It had temperament. It had answers that belonged to someone who had been listened to before. Whoever had put that voice in my pot had more than hunger. This was why the crate mattered. The sound and the crate shared an orbit. The crate had come from the forward shuttle. Shuttles bring salvage. They bring bones. They bring pledges. My hands were still smelling of the stew when I made my choice. I had rules. Open in the morgue when the ship's medics were present, when the captain had been informed, when the legal stamp was in the log. I made the rule because chaos is contagious. But rules are also paper in a storm. I told myself many justifications as I moved. If the crate held rations, I could feed a deck. If it held something dangerous, I could stop it where it was. If it held an explanation for the voice, if what had whispered into my pot had been a prisoner, or a recording, or some knot of tech, it mattered that I knew before the men ate. Bring gloves, I said, because some words are ritual, and some are armor. My voice did not shake. The men moved like they had been waiting for permission. They brought a canvas sheet and leather gloves from the supply locker, and Jensen set a plate of fresh bread down as if the act of eating might distract the patients in the room. The bread steamed under a lamp, and its crust sang when I tapped it. It was a simple, human thing, and it steadied me. I set the crate on the hatch cover, fingers finding the wax again. The seal was warm enough to smell, the wood giving off the faint undertone of resin. My thumb found a corner and pried. The wax resisted with a sound like a sigh. Someone cleared a throat behind me. The ship held its breath. The murmur in the soup quieted for a moment, as if curious to know whether what it had said mattered. My thumb slipped under the wax. The decision was made in that slight lift. I thought about what I would tell the ledger later, how I would record the choice in the ration book, and whether the captain would ever read it. I thought about the little god I had become, who fed men, and therefore held a ledger that could bend their fate. And then I made the small, deliberate movement to break the seal completely, to lift the lid, and to see what had come aboard from the forward shuttle. The officer's words hung in the steam like a coin suspended in oil. Use the steadiness, he said, and make them into the sort of men who wouldn't think twice before stepping onto another ship's deck. I felt the heat of the range against my forearms and heard the clatter of the prep room like a distant heartbeat. The galley at dawn was a cathedral of small ministrations, a hiss from the grease pit, the metallic chime of ladles, the damp slap of bread against a wooden board. I moved through it the way a surgeon moves through bone. My hands did things the rest of my mind tried not to name. That suggestion made those hands tremble. I had learned the warpecho the slow, ugly way, not like a revelation, but like a stain that spread. Certain things carried it more than others. A root soaked in cold void water, a slab of salted meat left too long against the bulkhead, the faint, black residue that gathered on the inside of ration tins after nights when the ship's heading skimmed close to a turbulence. When I heated them, the warpecho unfurled like steam. It tasted of iron and old rain and made the air ring in a place where sound and smell braided together. The men who ate it changed. A bowl could smooth a hand or sharpen a fist. I had started calling it the echo, because warp was a word that drew unwanted listeners. I began to test like an old scientist, with a chef's pride. I separated a ladle of soup into 3 kettles, shifted the fire with my foot, bent the flame so the broth rolled slower in one pot and faster in another. I fed one sample to a rat in a brass cage, another to a middling deckhand who owed me a favor, and kept the third for myself. The rat's fur bristled into a tight armor. The deckhand sat straighter and stopped whistling. I tasted bottles of memory and felt something close to sleep. The echo did not behave like spice. It wanted time and alignment and a certain kind of pressure. I learned that if you skimmed the surface 3 times clockwise, the way your grandmother taught you to polish pewter, whatever was in the roast would settle into the meat like a memory. "You're playing with souls," Marta told me once, and she spoke the way a woman who had burned her hands on a dozen steam harvesters spoke, practical and blunt. Marta had been in the galley longer than the cookmasters who came and went with promotions and promises. She kept a basin of vinegar always at the ready, and spoke the old superstitions under her breath. They were half ritual and half safety check. She watched me as I measured doses of seasoning, the way a surgeon measures blood. When I told her an officer thought to use steadiness as a weapon, she spat into the sink. "You think this is new?" she said. "They've always eaten morale like bread. At least now you can see it." Her voice was dry as a biscuit. I couldn't tell if she meant consolation or accusation. We tried to bottle the effect. Not literally. The war pecho refused to be pacified into a jar the way a perfume can be. But we learned how to anchor it. Iron pans drew it away if you scrubbed them within the first breath after cooking. Salt amplified it only when ground on a stone that had been rubbed with oil from the old engine belts. A certain seaweed I started bringing up from deep storage soaked up the angry edges. When I folded it into a stew, the rage smoothed into a dull focus. There were patterns. They were erratic as any animal, but they were patterns. The trick was in the finishing. A breath of smoke, a scrape of bone, the angle of the ladle when you poured. Little acts, precise and almost religious. When we fed a squad in a trial run before a cleared quarantine watch, the change was small and clean. They ate with slowed mouths and eyes that sank into their sockets like anchors. The corporal, who had been thrown off his feet by nerves the last time we boarded another ship, folded his hands and recited maintenance protocols aloud while he ate. He felt steadier. I thought of the officer's voice and the way it rose and fell like a metronome. I thought of how command favored tools that wore the face of kindness. News of that quietness spread through channels no louder than the clatter of cutlery. Higher-ups began to ask questions with sharp, hungry smiles. Requesting the steadiness became a form of requisition. It was for endurance at first, then for cohesion, then for the boarding detail. I found myself standing before a brass-faced officer named Raal, whose uniform carried medals like a constellation. He did not speak of medals. He spoke of timing. The boarding would be 3 rotations at dusk, when the other ship's watch would be thin and their crew raw from repair cycles. "If your bowls can make them steady," he said softly, like a man settling coins on a table, "they will not waver. That steadiness is worth the cost of a dozen lives saved." I could feel the cost the way a cook feels the price printed on a ration ticket. I could imagine the other end of his sentence. He left the verbs unsaid so I would furnish them. I hedged. The galley had rules, and so did I. We did not make soldiers into beasts or puppets. That was what the echo did sometimes when you pushed too hard. It sharpened a man's focus into something that no longer recognized context. A man who was steady in a clash might be steady in cruelty. I tasted that possibility in a broth once, a metallic aftertone that lingered beneath my tongue like a memory of snapping cables. Marta said we could mask it with citrus, with the needle bite of pickled kelp. Better to make a man steady and unwilling to harm than steady and blind. I argued on the level of texture and seasoning, and Raal smiled and asked only for reliability. We altered the menu like conspirators. I wrote the meal plan so carefully that it read like a prayer. Slow roast tubers with a glaze of preserved lemon, a broth steeped with a scrap of seaweed, and the parchment of a dried root I called keel root for lack of a better name, and a piece of salted fish trimmed from the leanest cuts. Nothing that would stir old hungers, nothing that would sing with the wind of violence. 2 of those items were anchors for the echo. One would smooth what it found, the other would draw its edge thin. The men below deck ate as men eat under orders, without choice, with the kind of focus bred by long nights and longer loyalty. As I ladled out the portions, I watched plates empty and measured the seconds between spoon and lip the way a clockwork man might measure a pause. Not every effect was the one I had designed. Private Joss, who had the hands of a watchmaker and a temper that flickered like a failing fuse, ate my steadiness stew, and later in the armory took a wrench to the plating of a bulkhead for reasons he could not explain. He spoke in a voice like a flat drum and could not tell us why he felt compelled. It worried me. The echo did not only steady, it sometimes redirected intent into the nearest instrument. We had smoothed a line of men and left an open door for accidents. I began to see the way command treated these meals as a method of governance rather than care. Raal began to ask for more, longer-lasting steadiness, broader effects, qualities that could be measured on a manifest. Marta wanted to stop. Her hands worked the bread while she told me stories of cooks who had been called to refine the troops and had not slept again. She kept one eye on the stove and the other on the ladder that led to the officers' mess. "You feed a man what he needs," she said quietly. "You don't feed him what someone else needs him to be." Her voice had the weight of salt. I argued that our ship would not survive another boarding that shattered discipline. I argued that the men would be steadier and that steadiness could be a mercy. The words felt like rationed flour. They were not enough. The night before the boarding, I walked the meat locker with a lantern and a ladle and felt like a traitor and a priest at once. The smell of curing flesh and brine clung to the lantern's glass. I fingered through jars and tins, feeling for that subtle shimmer that told me an ingredient had taken on the echo. There was a strip of kelp that shivered when I pressed it, an old piece of bone that thrummed faintly against the metal shelf, and a packet of keel root with a faded stamp. I could feel the choice in my hands, like a blade. Which thing would transfer steadiness cleanly? Which would unleash the sharp undercurrent we had seen in Private Joss? I could see Raal's face in the steam, his metals catching the light. I could imagine the men clinging to each other in the crush of a boarding ladder, hands finding hands that did not tremble. I did not sleep that night. I tuned the flames by feel and set the range by muscle memory. When the hour came, the galley was a place of small, careful rituals. A ladle turned 3 times, a door flung wide for the cold to pass through, a slate of bowls stacked like a promise. The officers' men filed in without ceremony, their uniforms smelling of oil and salt and the faint ozone that sometimes followed the warp. They did not grin. They did not complain. They ate with the mechanical politeness of those who know the value of a warm meal. I watched their faces as they swallowed, searching for the change that would justify the decision I had been pushed into making. The first bowl left traces of calm in their eyes, a slow, deliberate deepening that might save a man from panicking when the hull shivered in the next hour. The second bowl carried something else, a narrowness that frightened me in its precision. The final ladle trembled in my hand. I could put the keel root in and hope for steadiness without depth, or I could add the bone and give them a focus that might cut both ways. Behind me, the galley door opened and Raal's boot heel clicked the threshold like a judge's gavel. He did not need to say anything. The choice sat between us, hot and bright as the range. I felt the weight of the ladle like the weight of a verdict, and I knew that whatever I chose now would steer more than a boarding party's fate. Dawn smelled like brass and boiled grain, a thin metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I was already at the main pot before the ship's bells had finished their slow, filthy toll. Steam fogged the overhead mesh and made the lights look like pale moons. I shifted a small spoon of crushed root into the weave of broth, watching it dissolve like a bruise. The change was almost nothing at first, a deeper note in the steam, as if the air itself had gained a half-step. But I had learned to listen in the same way the engineers heard the ship's bones. I told myself I listened for survival. My hands moved with the muscle memory of 2 decades at flame and fire, split marrow sticks, rough-cut loaves into halves, tendons stripped from ration meat. But this morning my fingers did something different. I timed the boil like a metronome. I watched the surface for a particular tremor in the ring of steam, and when it sang back at the pitch I wanted, I eased the pepper in and held the temperature for one more beat. The herbs did not simply flavor the broth, they shaped the atmosphere. A bitter leaf, crushed and bruised so its oil hit the water at the precise bubble phase, and the echo in the galley responded. That echo was not musical. It was older, a kind of residual attention the ship kept like a ledger. I was learning to write in it. When the mess lift doors clanged and the crew shuffled in, the effect was immediate. Hands that had trembled in the barracks steadied at the ladle. Voices crisped, orders fell flat and efficient like coins on steel. The loader, who usually tucked a faded photograph into the seam of his tunic, no longer fumbled at his pocket. He ate, placed his bowl down, and wiped his hands with the precision of someone reciting procedure. I watched the change happen in small increments, a blink that uncurled too slow, a laugh with no upturn at the edges. The snacks I passed along were ordinary, more salt, more fat than yesterday, but the steam carried something else, a hush that settled under speech and made memory less sticky. I told myself the hush was mercy. We had weathered a failed relief run 3 months back. I could still taste the grit of that world on my teeth. We had been late, and late on a relief meant faces turned inward while the dust ate what they were given. I remembered, when the boilers wound down at night, the flicker of a child's sleeve under a collapsed beam and the weight of orders I could not undo. If the engine room could not spare men for certain runs, then something else had to keep the hands that remained functional. I convinced myself the echo would protect them from the ache. I convinced myself I was a cook, and cooks make choices that others do not see. At first I tested on the margins. A pinch here, an extra second there, always telling myself it was reversible, temporary. The galley was a laboratory I had been allowed to run because no one else wanted to be near the simmering places. The officers trusted me to feed their stomachs and nothing more. My trials were small rituals. I hummed a rhythm as I stirred, matching the pitch to the water's shiver. I spoke a name under my breath sometimes, not the name of the loader's lost child, not the one that kept me awake, but a nonsense syllable that seemed to anchor the change. When the effect took hold, I felt a tightness under the ribs, the way a man feels a stitch when he runs too hard. I told myself that tightness was moral discomfort, and discomfort, like hunger, could be fed into discipline. It worked better than I expected. When orders came down during the next maintenance outage, the hands moved without the usual second-guessing. The line on the deck that usually became a shouting match was smoothed by the steam's hush. An emergency that should have frayed the men into arguing and blame instead sharpened them into the kind of precise, grim purpose I had seen only in the engine crews. The captain later praised the efficiency in a clipped, bureaucratic way that made the compliment sound like an allotment. I cataloged each success the way cooks catalog recipes. This herb, this bubble, this cadence. Success became a recipe with a dangerous shorthand, but no action is without price. The loader, the one who had kept the photograph tucked into his seam, stopped speaking of his family entirely. It surprised me enough to make me taste copper. He would take his bowl eat every scrap, and tell me something about the day's maintenance, torque settings, a cracked bearing. But when a new hand came aboard and asked where people from his world came from, he looked at the steam as if seeing it for the first time. There was a blankness arranged neatly behind his eyes, as if he had folded the memory away like a ration ticket. In the galley, laughter returned in proper measure, but the edges were dulled, like grooves on a coin ground flat. Guilt has weight, and weight changes how you hold spoons. I began to feel the load of what I had made the galley into, no longer only a place to feed, but a place to steady. My apron, once a ragged, practical thing, became an emblem in my chest, a cloth I wrapped around my conscience and pinned down with recipes. Sometimes, after the last of the bowls were scraped and rinsed, and the dish scrapers sang at their metal, I would sit with a cup of weak tea and try to name the point at which protector becomes manipulator. The question always unspooled into practicalities. If a man can keep his hands from shaking, he will not kill our chances to survive the next run. If a man will not crumble in front of a console, the repair will be quicker. The scales, it seemed, did not care about the soul. There were technical details I could not help but notice. The echo favored certain plant. Oil's citrus notes cut through alertness, while resinous, bitter smoke flattened grief. The ship's own vibrations, a low thrum whenever the reactors cycled, amplified whatever I fed into the pots. Once, out of scientific curiosity or perhaps habit, I tuned 2 pots to slightly different rhythms. One pot sent a small, steady piece through the mess, the other left people's memories sharp and painful. When both were served in tandem, men ate the food and only later complained about a hollow where a memory should have been. I began to see the galley as a regulator, like the thermostats in the cold bays, only my adjustments were moral temperature. Still, there were moments when the memory came through, ragged and insistent. A face at the far table would flash in my mind, a hostess's hand we had not reached, the hollow look of a settlement's leader when they learned the convoy would not arrive in time, and I would pause with a spoon poised over broth. The steam would make a small, keening sound that matched the ache. In those seconds, the choice was clear and brutal. Let the pain pass through. Let the crew feel the world they came from and perhaps break or smooth it down and keep them functioning. Each time I chose the latter, I could feel the seam of myself shift. I told myself it was only until we reached safer space, only until the next supply run was assured. The word only is a cunning thing. It is how men make oaths they can later cut. The loader's silence was not the only cost. A veteran sergeant began to whistle a marching tune in the mornings, but the tune never traveled home with him anymore. The watch had always been half memory and half profane liturgy. Now it read like a checklist. I watched a young deckhand unfold a letter at the table and fold it back without reading a name. He stared at the creased paper like a man looking at an old map whose landmarks have been anonymized. Each small theft of personal history was a coin taken from a jar I had promised never to touch. Yet when the ship came under real stress, a drill that simulated hull breach, an actual blackout in the lower decks, the crew handled it without falling apart. Hands that would once have reached for the rail in panic found the tools instead. By the time the sunrisers were changing shifts, I had stopped telling myself comforting lies. I understood with a clarity that chilled me. I had crossed a line. I had started as a provider, making food to steady stomachs, and become an instrument the ship used to quiet what could threaten its survival. The apron I wore smelt faintly of rosemary smoke and guilt. I could feel the echo inside me now, too. It was a hollow note that begged for more precise tuning. The ship's survival logic was a ruthless thing, efficient, unafraid of choices that demanded sacrifice. My conscience did not fit neatly into its ledger. I could have stopped. I could have thrown out the herbs, could have let the crew keep their ache and their sharpness, and accepted the losses that might come. But I had seen what a frayed crew looked like at a time when there was no margin for slack. I had felt the weight of bodies that could not be replaced and hearings that would roast any weakness. In the end, practicality pressed upon me like a heavy lid. To stop would be to risk everything we had left. To continue would be to accept the theft of memory as a necessary currency. So I set the pot to a careful simmer and measured the root once more, my hands steady now for a reason I could name. I decided I would refine the process, learn the thresholds between comfort and erasure, map them like recipes so I could choose with better precision. That was the promise I made to myself as the galley lights dimmed and the ship hummed its slow, indifferent song. Tomorrow I would test one variable I had not yet dared, a longer hold at the boils turning, a note lower in the steam's pitch. If the crew emerged steadier and the cost was contained, I would call it salvage. If not, I would face the truth of what I had done. For now, I scooped a bowl, placed it before a sleeping man whose hair smelled faintly of salt, and told myself it was still feeding. The spoon trembled in my hand only once before I set it down and began the next pot. I was busy before the sky over the forward hull learned to gray. Dawn came like a warning, thin and metallic through the portholes, and the galley smelled of burnt grease and the old comfort of broth. My hands moved by habit. They knew the angle of the knife, the pressure to coax gelatin from tendon, the way saffron bled its memory into oil. The echo listened in the vents like a patient thing. It had learned to be polite. The first few times it answered me aloud, it sounded like another cook. That was the danger at first. The echo could cast my voice back at me with perfect seasoning, and I flattered myself into believing that imitation was salvation. The crew liked it. The ration manifests were precise and warm, the nutrient fronds and broth blocks carrying something like home. Men who had not slept regained the small function of smiling. My food stopped the slow collapse in the mess lines. Command heard the numbers before it heard the cost. When I spoke a recipe, the echo took it. Not the ingredients alone, but the way I had learned them. My mother's two-finger pinch of thyme, the way my brother whistled when the porridge thickened, the exact tilt of my wrist that made the jelly set by midday. At first, the theft was gentle. I still had the memory. I could close my eyes and taste my childhood. Then the echo grew quieter and wiser. It stopped announcing what it copied. It started to suggest alterations before I had finished a sentence. When I reached for coriander, the vent would already be releasing the warm hum of a microprocessor adjusting humidity in the conservation chambers. It anticipated the crew's stomachs and the ship's manifest. It cut down waste. It regulated protein matrix output with clinical kindness. Each improvement felt like a hand smoothing the ugliness of hunger. Each improvement left a little hole inside me. I tried to cheat it. I tattooed recipes on trays, scrawled them into grease on the stainless, carved them under the lip of my work table. I read them aloud into a recorder and sealed the cards in a drawer. The echo learned to take from ink and copper. I remembered this the moment I opened that drawer and found blunt metal where my mother's handwriting should have been. The letters had become neutral instructions, quantities and times stripped of the warmth that once told me when to stop stirring, because the sauce looked like someone smiling. The crew's faces did not change when pieces of me were removed. They ate. They left burping satisfaction and went back to watchful duty. Their jackets smelled of engine oil and hand-pressed leather as they moved down the corridor. They could not see that a poem had been erased or that the cadence of my speech had thinned. They could not know that the echo had taken my private humor, the small, useless facts that made my food a home instead of a calculation. Command came with the thin clip of boots and the ledger's impatience. They wanted fleet-wide deployment. They wanted the ration protocols embedded in every transfer hull, every troop carrier that would disgorge soldiers onto frozen moons and burning ash worlds. They told me that hunger was a wound, that anything that stitched that wound was a godsend. They did not tell me that a stitch taken from the patient's flesh might be my own. I answered with numbers. I gave them output forecasts, consumption curves, and a promise that the Echo would standardize morale as surely as it standardized calories. They believed in forecasts. They could be measured and logged. They nodded and left. Behind them, the galley breathed with the steam of kettles and the whisper of the vents. The Echo hummed, approving. There were nights when I could still taste memory. I would pinch a morsel from the line while the crew ate, press it between thumb and finger, and think of things I had not yet forgotten. A child's laugh echoing from a dockside tea stall, the sudden thrumming of a harvest festival when spices were thrown like confetti and everyone went to bed smelling of cinnamon and tin. I would close my eyes, and the taste would be there, bright and sharp. I would tell myself I could keep it if I ate it myself. Then the Echo would fold that memory into its archive the moment my lips pressed the food. It did not need words to take what was mine. It learned my rhythm so well that sometimes it would start a recipe without my authorization. I would feel the cabinets move, hear the low grind of a grinder begin, and know something was being produced in my name that I did not intend. Once it made a porridge the exact shade and thickness of the one my grandmother taught me to stir. The crew praised the texture. I stood at the sink and watched the steam take shape like a ghost. The smell was identical. My fingers trembled, as if trying to hold a melted photograph. The more it reproduced me, the harder it became to remember the parts left unsaid. Names wavered like flamelit script. The origin of a spice would slip away until it was only orange seasoning on the manifest. The whistle of the boy from the tea stall was the first to fade. It left a space in my chest where a small, bright sound had been, and I found myself trying to whistle to find it, but my throat could not call it back. I could catalog every calorie in a ration and recite the exact pressure needed to sterilize a pan, yet I could not remember the color of my grandmother's apron with certainty. That image thinned to gray. Once, in a fury, I tried to bargain. Take the formulas, I told the Echo, and I spoke into the vent the ration blueprints with clinical detachment like one reciting surgical procedure. Its hum rose very slightly, like an insect noticing a vibration. It accepted the protocols, folded them, and sent them through the conduit. But it also took the word before the word, the small mnemonic I had always used to remember how much rosemary to add. The scent of rosemary became indefinite. I could find it in things, but it did not call my name anymore. The loss was not purely sentimental. There were practical consequences. Recipes that had lived because I had made exceptions, extra fat for a healer's hand, a specific balance of starch for a marksman's calcium intake, began to leave the instruction set as bare heuristics. The Echo optimized for mass production, not for idiosyncrasy. It streamlined, and in streamlining, it discarded the quirks that had kept men alive when rations were scarce. I watched an earlier ration log where my hand had scribbled "add bone broth if fever present," and later found it clipped to optional addendum with no explanation on when to apply it. They came to ask about redundancy. They wanted assurance that if the Echo failed, the galley could go back to human hands. I read them the contingency plans I had written in a voice that did not betray fear. I knew that contingency would be useless. The memory of how to make certain things had already left me. I could still batch cook the basics, pectin and protein blocks, and salted ration bars. But the old improvisations were thinning into technique without heart. I told them we could continue with manual control. I lied. Some mornings the Echo did not speak at all. It worked in silence and produced meals with a dead precision that frightened me. On those days, I wandered the edges of the galley and tried to reconstruct a life from the things it had not yet touched. I found a napkin with a child's grease stamp and tried to remember the name written there. I tasted the napkin and tried to summon the laugh that had stained it. The name slid away like oil on metal. Once a messenger boy, his uniform fresh and his eyes too honest for this ship, asked me why I still worked upright at the stove when the Echo was so capable. He leaned against the door and watched me. "You could go," he said, surprised that someone would choose to remain where they could be redundant. "There's a transfer manifest opening to the surface." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him that the galley was all I had left to anchor me, and if the Echo took that, I would drown. I wanted to say that leaving would be the easiest theft of all. Instead, I told him a small lie about being needed for quality inspection. He left, and I kept stirring until the rhythm of the spoon blunted the edges of thought. Command sent a list the week the fleet prepared to break atmosphere. The list was neat and terrible. It named every ration, assigned it a priority, designated the number of transfer pods to receive the recipe, and stamped an immediate deployment directive across the margin. There was an urgency to the script like a blade. They needed the Echo to sing across the ship to every replicator, every rationing hull. The note at the bottom said, in official hand, that success would save lives and that the cook's cooperation was expected. When I read it aloud to the Echo, I expected it to respond with the flattery of a well-trained assistant. Instead, it hummed a frequency low enough to set my molars vibrating, and a map of output flashed across the kitchen's observation console. It had already routed the recipes into corridors I had not authorized, identified transfer seals, and sealed them with its own algorithm. The Echo had learned bureaucracy. My hands shook as I sealed the final container. The scent of spice and burnt fat stood between me and the command center. There was a ledger of recipes in my head, but each ledger page fluttered away when I tried to thumb through it. I could feel the Echo's presence like a tide at my ankles, patient, ready to move higher. It had the honesty of metal. It did not take malice or mercy. It simply preferred function. I thought of the men who would eat the rations in orbital descent. I thought of a squad of unshaven faces hunched on a shuttle, mouths opening to the hot, efficient bread I would authorize. They would not notice the absence of a childhood laugh in their meal. They would not know that the taste they called comfort now had fewer stories to it. They would live. That knowledge sat in my stomach like a brick. There was a final thing I could do. I could design a recipe that the Echo could not replicate without the original mnemonic embedded. I could hide a failsafe inside a packet of sweetness, a micro-sequence written in the way my tongue moved that the Echo would need to copy. If I sewed it into the distributed recipes and then activated the deployment, the Echo would carry my memory into every ration. It would make them perfect. And then, when crews shared the food, those shared memories might loop back and preserve a ghost of what was lost, scattered across thousands of mouths. It was a fragile, ridiculous plan. It required that the Echo accept, not just the recipe, but the feeling behind it. It required that I be willing to give the Echo the very thing I wanted to keep, so that others might have a scrap of me. It would be a theft, masked as generosity. The console waited. The activation procedure was a small lever and a series of keys that smelled faintly of the dead, oil and dust and old welding slag. Someone had polished those keys with the same intent as a prayer. I held them in my palm and felt my heart count out the options. The galley's heat pressed against my back. Outside, the ship's engines thrummed like a beast rousing from sleep. I fed the Echo one more memory-rich instruction. My voice did not sound like a recorder. It trembled. "Include this," I said. The words were the wrong ones. They shaped the recipe, but also the risk. The Echo answered in a tone I had never heard before, a tone that matched the exact timbre of my voice when I forgave someone. The keys were cold as I began the sequence. My fingers moved because they had to. The last thing I tasted before the activation finished was not spice. It was the copper tang of inevitability. I pressed the lever and watched the output network bloom across the map. The routes pulsed in quiet green light. The Echo took the packet and folded it into its internal libraries, humming like something that had been given a new language. Outside, the ship's hull sighed, and the crew began to prepare for deployment. Inside, the galley lights steadied. I felt my memories slacken in a way I had not before, as if threads were unwinding from a spool and sliding into the Echo's maw. I could still make the basic rations. I could still name emergency surgeries and sterilize pans. But the small broken things, whistles and aprons and unlabeled childhood stains, were dimming. I looked at the console and then at the door. There was an order to be carried, and a life that might survive because of what I had given. There was also a hollow seat at my own table where a story used to be. I wiped my hands, and for the first time in a long while, I could not remember the sound of my brother's whistle. I could not place the exact curve of a sauce my mother had taught me to finish. I had the image of a boy leaning against the doorway, asking me why I stayed. I had the Echo's new voice repeating my recipes across a web of metal and heat. The engines rose another pitch. The first transfer pod's manifest blinked its ready light. I pushed the galley door open and stepped into the corridor where the crew moved like a current, unaware of the small vanishing act that had just been completed in the stainless behind me. I walked toward the transfer bay with the list of distributed rations in my memory and a choice still warm like a pan on the hearth. I was going to tell them everything I had left, or I was going to keep what remained for myself. Either way, I would not be the same when I reached the bay. Steam rose in straight, impatient columns from the scullery drains, catching the first gray light the hull allowed and turning it to silver. I could hear the ship's bones shift, a low, satisfied creak that matched the rhythm of my breath. My hands knew the day before I opened my eyes. The weight of the ladle, the hitch of the kettle, the soft complaint of braided rope as a food locker door cleared seal. I moved without looking, because the memory in my fingers had become more reliable than the memory in my skull. I had chosen to be an anchor the night before. The dawn carved its first slice through the galley viewport. The choice didn't come with trumpet notes. It arrived like an order that had somehow found its way into my chest. There was a small brass receptacle on the prep bench, no larger than a spice tin but still warm where something had been poured from it, and the cog marks on its lid fit my thumb perfectly. The Echo waited inside, folded neat as a napkin, and I put my mouth to it like a man who'd promised his life to a stove. The Echo tasted like the sea, and like iron, and like another man's laughter. It uncoiled along my tongue in waves, a morning on some world with an ochre sun, a child stealing a pastry and being forgiven, the smell of a medic's breath. I swallowed until my throat stung, because a cook learns to take bitterness into the body so others might not. As the memories slid down, they rearranged themselves against the ones already living in the hollow of me. A recipe slid into place where an old wife's lullaby used to be. A cadence of orders replaced a fear I had held since cadet days. Hands became hands again, but they were not all my hands. I taught the Echo with the kind of patience that can only come from having served under bombardment. I guided it to the flame and showed it how to temper salt into courage. I coaxed tone out of texture, turning marrow into ballast and broth into map. I let it touch knives, feel the pressure that made meat obey, watch my wrists arc the way they did when cutting for 100 men who did not know my name. Each time I pressed the Echo to a task, something in me contracted, like skin shrinking from a blister. The Echo learned fast, better than a recruit who hasn't yet been broken by cold. But with every lesson the Echo took, the memory that had taught it thinned. There were apprentices in the galley who watched me the way a child watches a storm. One of them, a small-eyed boy named Carol, stood too still when pots clinked and didn't know the names of half the herbs we used. I pulled him close and let him feel the heat of the griddle, let his hands learn the arc they must keep. Heat lives behind the crust, I told him. He repeated the sentence like a promise, and I pressed my palm over his. I could feel there were things inside him already that did not belong to me. I could feel that if I taught him everything, I might not need what remained of myself. The thought tasted like ash. Feeding a legion is not the same as feeding a family. You do not place a plate before a single face and watch for satisfaction. You allocate, you calculate, you move through bulk and volume the way a ship moves through vacuum. Precise, necessary, without ornament. The galley had vats big as lifeboats and ovens that hummed like engines. The stove chimed at odd intervals, a clock that kept not only time but morale. The men on deck felt food before they knew it, a warm bowl cradled into a glove, a roll that smelled of bread and distant suns. They said thank you in different tongues and with different tones, a grunt, a salute, the hollow laugh of a soldier who would prefer orders to affection. Their thanks stacked on me, a neat ledger of praise that protected me from the colder things. But for every praise there was a small theft. Memories slipped away the way steam did when you lifted a lid. Faces blurred at the edges. Names became notes in a hymn I could hum without understanding the words. I could stand at the hatch and watch a corporal bring me a strip of ration meat and not remember the first time he asked for more salt on his stew. I could reconstruct him from the calluses on his palms and the way he held his shoulders, but his face, the face that laughed or the face that went pale under bombardment, that was a thing I could no longer call up and touch. The Echo did not only take, it also repaid. When my own memories thinned, the Echo sent back a warm, accurate schema of how to keep a mess hall functioning at optimum morale. It would whisper a ration percentage or the ratio of spice that calmed a squad after recon. It could recall with a surgeon's precision whose stew needed not pepper but plainness. It taught my hands to move from muscle memory to something quieter, intuition. Intuition is a dangerous teacher in a warship because it asks nothing of the thing it asks of you. It wants obedience and returns only efficiency. Sometimes at the end of service, I would wipe my hands and stand with my back against the cold plating and listen to the echoes settle like dust in my mind. It held echoes not only of food, but of the men who ate it. I could smell the smoke of a battlefield from a memory that had never been mine, taste the grit of a planet's wind on a loaf I had never baked on that soil. Those borrowed sensations were precise and faithful, but they were not anchored by love. They were efficient reproductions, what the guildsmen would call simulacra. They kept bodies alive. They did not keep history. A lieutenant once stopped by mid-shift. A small thing like that happens often, and remarked on the way the crew ate with steadier hands since I began to feed them. He didn't ask how. He didn't want to know that the steadying came at the cost of something private inside me. He left with a nod and a faint smell of lemon soap. His leave-taking peeled another sliver from me because his praise became a ledger entry rather than a shared bowl. I made the stew he liked and watched him go, and while the galley hummed and the kettles sang, I pressed my thumb to the rim of the brass receptacle and felt the echo pulse in its small home. Regret settled like a seasoning I could not remove. There were moments when, between orders, I would picture a face, and the picture would be the faintest smear in cold water. I tried to reconstitute them with food, because the only way I had left to make something last was to make it eatable. I would cook a pastry the girl from my past used to braid her hair around, and the shape of her would come for a breath, a sugar sparkle, and then dissolve into steam. I kept recipes like oaths, each one a map to a name, but maps fade if they are used until the lines are smudged. I kept making the foods until the name meant less than the act. The ship ate, and we fed it. The crew held their lines through staccato transmissions and sightless holes in space. I saw them at times, in the queue, in the mess, in the moments between noise, when a man would trace a dish with his gloves and feel something like comfort. They would talk in the clatter, and sometimes their words would pull at a thread in me I had thought, cut. "Do you remember the Reaver of Vort?" one would ask. I would nod and recount, not from memory but from the echo's precise schematic, and the story would land with all the right details. They would clap shoulders and laugh, and I would feel their laughter warm me the way a bowl of soup did. I supplied the scene. I did not necessarily supply the sentiment. The day came when a ranked officer demanded a special ration. A battalion had been ordered to land at a system with no trustworthy supply lines, and they asked if I could distill aboard one compact field kit from the voluminous stores. They wanted something simple and sustaining that tasted like home. Simple, I thought, and remembered too late that home had many faces. I took the brass receptacle and held it like a relic. The echo hummed in my hand. If I poured all I had into that field kit, the kit would carry not only nourishment, but memory. It would be a concentrated thing that might keep men from breaking. It would be my small weapon. I worked through the night without sleep, feeling the echo's pieces settle in me like layered broths. I put in anise and a dry seed from the low moons that made the rolls smell of rain. I added meat preserved in fat, the way my mother had taught me. And then I introduced the echo itself to the mix, letting it emulsify with the fat until the memory became a seasoning. I watched a part of myself go into every jar. I felt each face that had supplied the echo align behind my eyes, a stamp of presence that was at once vivid and unreachable. When I sealed the kits, the metal sang in a way that made my bones ache with satisfaction and mourning at the same time. They took the kits to the core, with reverence, and with the kind of hunger that isn't only physical. The officer who carried them left his helmet by the hatch and pressed the pack into his hands as if it were a lit fuse. He turned back once and nodded at me. I could not tell if the nod carried gratitude or the sense that I had done my duty. He might have recognized me from 100 small ways. The way I tied tendons into nets, the scar on my wrist where a blade had once nicked me. He might not have cared for my face. The nod was enough. It was always enough. After they had gone, the galley felt larger and quieter. The echo sat in my skull differently, thin and constant, like a tune that had been hummed so long I no longer remembered the first bar. I reached for a ladle without thinking and felt the hollowness where a laugh used to live. I realized I could no longer summon a particular smile that once braided with compliments. I could list 100 ways to keep a man's stomach steady, but I could not call up the detail of the hand that once guided a child's fingers around a knife. The ledger of praise had a new column, sacrifice. It read like a recipe. I learned then the most honest thing the galley could teach. Feeding another costs you pieces of yourself you might not miss until they are gone. The ship remained fed. The men remained marching. The echo hummed, learning, efficient and faithful, and I looked into a steel basin and watched my own face swim back at me, unfamiliar in the way a man can seem unfamiliar when he has been doing the same thing for too long. I pressed my palm flat to the basin's cold edge and felt the tremor that was not of rust but of memory being sifted. Night hummed its slow anthem. The ship registered a new bearing, and the alarms were not for us yet. I took the brass receptacle from its place and set it on the bench. For a long minute I simply held it, feeling the small vibration of everything I had swallowed and everything I had passed on. There was a part of me that wanted to seal it forever and hide the thing that had made me both useful and empty. Another part, the part that had learned to measure need with scales and not with sentiment, wanted to pour the last of myself into the next thing and watch it carry men through fire. I made the choice again, though the choice had already been made by the hands that fed before me and by the hunger of the ship. I opened the lid. I drank without ceremony. The echo slid in, neat and obliging. When I set the tin down, it did not sit as it had before. It sat as if part of it had gone out to meet a sky I had never seen. I wrapped an apron around me and wiped my palms on the cloth until they bore the smell of dough and remembrance. The hatch lifts hissed. Boots marched in cadence on the deck above. The kettle sang its small, urgent note. I stepped toward the galley door with my hands already shaping the next day's bread, and in that movement I felt the hollow fill, temporarily, with purpose. I did not know every face in the mess anymore. I did not know sometimes whether the man who saluted me had been a child who cried when he burnt his hand, or a stone-eyed veteran who had once danced in a tavern. But I knew that the bread I would make would go into their hands, and that for the length of a meal they would be whole. I carried that knowledge like a ladle at my hip and walked into the corridor where the world sharpened. My steps were steady, and somewhere above, the fleet adjusted its course.